Tiz, a vulnerable young Brazilian girl, finds herself speeding through the night towards the lights of a big city. Her companion is a man who has promised her parents that he will find their daughter work as a maid. What awaits her there is something different, however, and her life becomes increasingly fraught with danger, both mental and physical.
Interwoven into this tragic and violent storyline is the account of a young doctor whose life and love affair in the south of England are in stark contrast to the dangerous, sexually abusive situation in which Tiz finds herself. Yet their stories and that of their families become closely linked. You are listening to Tiz from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight by Deborah Vaughan. Part 7. Comfort's Delight. Aidan, an 18-year-old English boy, has been tricked into visiting a brothel while on holiday in Brazil. Once home, he is racked with guilt about this. He is also oppressed by the sight of the poverty he has witnessed. His mother, Emily, waits for his flight at London Heathrow. Emily stood in Terminal 1 arrivals at Heathrow Airport, her heart singing because very soon Aidan would be home again.
It's been so quiet, she thought. However am I going to manage when he leaves for medical school in the autumn and I have to start disentangling my life from his? Why did you have to die, Andrew? She murmured. I need you so much. I don't know how I'm going to cope on my own. Knowing that the plane had landed and that he would soon appear, however, Emily put these sad thoughts aside for the time being and allowed her heart to begin its welcome song once more. At last, little groups of travellers began to trickle out of the customs hall, and she scanned each face excitedly, wondering, as she always did in airports, where all these folk had come from, and hoping that someone who loved them was waiting for them. They all looked so tired and dishevelled, she thought, as a particularly weary woman stumbled past her, pushing a loaded trolley. But that's only to be expected when they've been journeying for so long.
At last, Reese, large and lumbering, came into view, followed by the one person in the world she was really longing to see, her son. However, as he came closer, she felt a pang of worry, as he seemed more than normally tired. He was also dragging his feet and looked dazed and ill. Reaching up, she hugged him tightly to her, sensing that indeed there was something the matter, as there was a tension in him that seemed at odds with his obvious tiredness. It was like hugging a taut wire stretched near to breaking point.
What's the matter with Aidan? She said sharply, turning to Reese.
Oh, he's just a bit weary, replied her brother-in-law dismissively. Nothing a good night's sleep won't put right. However, in the morning the situation hadn't changed. Aidan said very little when he eventually came downstairs, and after having drunk a cup of tea went straight back to his room, shutting the door firmly behind him. It was Sunday, and Emily waited in vain for him to reappear.
Perhaps he's just very jet-lagged, she said to herself when she came in from the garden at lunchtime and discovered that he was still upstairs. By the time 5 o'clock came, she was seriously worried, so went up to his bedroom and knocked on the door. When she went in, she found him lying on the bed, wide awake, staring fixedly at the ceiling, his face white and drawn. Sitting down on the end of the bed, she looked anxiously at him. "What's the matter, darling?" she inquired gently, trying to keep the concern out of her voice.
"Nothing much, Mum," he muttered. "I've just seen one or two things that have upset me, that's all."
"Would it help to talk about them?" asked his mother.
"Well, perhaps a bit," he replied hesitatingly, and he told Emily about the little boy in the village. "It was dreadful, Mum," he said desperately. "There was no one there to help him but me. Where were his parents? I think that he was nearly dead when I found him," he added. "Should I have picked him up and taken him with me? But where to? Oh, Mum, what should I have done?" and he looked at her pleadingly, his face a picture of misery. Emily thought for a minute before replying. She wasn't sure what she'd expected to hear, but it certainly wasn't this. What should she say? How could she comfort him? At last, she said tentatively,
I don't see what else you could have done, Aidan. You were all on your own. You're not trained to deal with a critically ill child, and you're in a strange country. A doctor would have known exactly what was wrong and what could be done, but at the moment you don't have that knowledge. I would have been just as confused, she added as an afterthought, reaching out and clasping his hand reassuringly.
But I should have done something, anything, sighed Aidan miserably. All I did was tip water over him and write a stupid poem. How pathetic is that?
Emily tried her best to reassure him with every argument she could think of, but nothing she said seemed to lift her son's spirits. What did Reese say? She asked eventually when she saw that her words were not helping. Aidan told her in a voice loud with anger. There was a silence as Emily digested this information, then said, almost to herself, I could never understand how two brothers could be so different. Your father would never, ever have said anything like that. He cared deeply about people, all people.
On Monday morning, Emily left for work with a heavy heart. Aidan, who'd been woken by the sound of the car starting, desperately tried to go back to sleep, but each time he closed his eyes, he saw either the fly-covered face of the sick child or the contorted body of the girl on the bed in the brothel. Indeed, he had thought about nothing else, since Reese had woken him in his hotel room on the morning of their departure and bundled him into his clothes. All the while his uncle had been packing his case, he had sat slumped on his bed, aware that Reese was angry with him, but he'd been too confused to work out why. The first part of the long journey home had felt like a bad dream to Aidan, as although he knew his head was aching badly, he nonetheless found it difficult to keep his eyes open. His brain indeed seemed to be full of foam, and his legs and arms too large for his body. Gradually, as the airplane droned its way across the endless sky, however, his mind had begun to clear, and he'd been forced to face the events of the previous night. Where had he been? Who was the girl? Why had she screamed? How had he hurt her so badly? The questions had buzzed round his head like a cloud of hornets. At last he turned to Reese and demanded, Uncle, what exactly happened last night? We went to a brothel, boy, but you weren't quite up to it, his uncle had replied abruptly. Who was she? The girl in the room, he'd persisted. And why did she scream? Just a new whore, Reese had said dismissively. Don't worry about her. She'll get used to it. And with that he'd firmly turned away from his nephew and begun working on his laptop.
Aidan had lapsed into silence, feeling black hatred for his uncle well up inside him. How dare Reese take him to a brothel without even asking him? How had he ever got him to agree to it? Had he been drugged in some way, or just drunk? All these and 1,000 other questions had swirled around his confused brain for the entire trip home.
However, the worst thing of all was that he couldn't get the girl out of his head. Her shrieks still reverberated in his ears even now, and the thin line of blood trickling down her inner thigh had got into his dreams, where it became a scarlet river that he'd endeavoured to dam with his hands, only to fail. He'd woken from one particularly vivid nightmare, where he'd been trying frantically to get help, shaking and sweating. For a long time he'd gazed into the darkness of the night, feeling like the poor tormented wretch in Edvard Munch's The Scream, who, having been chased halfway over a narrow bridge across a black abyss, then sees some terrifying apparition coming towards him, from which there is no escape.
Aidan eventually decided that if he couldn't rest, then he must get out of the house. So he dressed and set out for the centre of the city. It was a long walk, but he felt his head had cleared a little by the time he arrived. Just as he reached the shopping centre with its bustling lunchtime crowds, he heard the cathedral clock strike 12. Aidan was an atheist, and his only experience of religion had been at his Church of England primary school. But the thought occurred to him that he might find some peace of mind in the cathedral. So he made his way into the close and up to a side door that gave access to the building. He couldn't remember the last time he'd visited the magnificent old church. So, before going in, he stopped and gazed up in awe at the great towering mass of stone above him, and then at the line of disapproving statues over the doorway, who were glaring critically down over the close. His attention was caught by the enormous flying buttresses holding up the tower, and he'd begun to speculate about how much weight they must be bearing, when a party of teenage schoolgirls rounded the corner of the cathedral and crowded into the entrance porch ahead of him, talking and chattering.
They sound like a flock of angry geese, he thought absently, as he heard their teachers trying to hush them into silence. After they'd gone inside and all was quiet again, Aidan noticed a sign over the door which read, "Welcome to the Cathedral Church of St. Peter and the Holy, Indivisible Trinity." Wow! Who on earth are that lot? And will they be around inside? He wondered wryly. Slowly, he pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped in. He had expected the interior to be empty and silent, but the reverse was true. It took him some moments to realize what was happening as he observed several hundred teenagers milling around, crowding round tables set up in the nave. The air was filled with the subdued hubbub of their voices, and he realized with dismay that the building had been taken over by the local schools for a university fair. Dismally, he sat down on an ugly chair near the almost deserted cathedral shop, and thought bitterly that the one place he might have found rest had been temporarily ruined by education.
He closed his eyes, for he was desperately tired. The ubiquitous chatter at once seemed more like the restful murmur of the sea on the shore than an irritating distraction. The sound rose up to the lofty vaulted ceiling of the nave, where it curled and spiralled round the arches and corbels, and spilled down again in wave after wave of gentle, soothing, anonymous noise. Somehow, despite the presence of so many people nearby, the murmuring of their voices began to soothe him, and in the cathedral's ancient womb he fell asleep. Awakening some minutes later, he stumbled to his feet and made his way along the side of the nave to the quiet depths of the chancel. There were no students here, and the sound of their voices soon began to fade. Around this central area ran a long, wide corridor, complete with various effigies and tombs, one of which was being industriously cleaned by a white-haired volunteer. On looking closer, Aidan saw that the tomb belonged to Gervais, Duke of Rouen, who appeared to have been recently renovated, as he was resplendent in bright crimson and silver armour. The scent of polish and ammonia hung heavy in the air.
Glancing to the right as he ambled past the spring-cleaned Duke, Aidan came to a sudden halt, his eye lighting on a most unusual scene. At first he thought two people were sitting by the wall, but no, it was a Holy Family group. Joseph, Mary, and the infant Jesus in his manger. Mary was kneeling parallel to the wall at right angles to the long side of the manger, and the baby Jesus, his arms wide open in welcome, was facing Aidan. However, the most astonishing thing about the group was that the father, Joseph, kneeling at the back of the manger, seemed somehow to enfold mother, baby, and the manger in a protective, all-encompassing embrace. Aidan stood and gazed at the little group. Then he hunkered down on the step of Gervaise's tomb, his arms round his knees, and scrutinized the sculpture more closely. Somehow the figure of Joseph seemed to represent all the powerful, loving strength of the perfect Father. This man was determined to protect, to cherish, and to keep safe both mother and baby. The baby seemed indeed to be grafted onto Joseph's body in some way as an integral part of him. Why, oh why, did my father die when I was so young? He thought miserably, feeling alone and isolated. How wonderful it would have been to have had a man like Joseph to guide and comfort me all these years. He would have understood how I feel now, and his heart went out in deep longing for the protection of a father's love. That's what fathers are all about, he mused, as his eyes filled with tears of grief for what he'd never experienced.
Hastily brushing his tears away, he wandered on a bit further and found his attention attracted by the flickering lights of several small candles. Going closer, he saw that this was a place where visitors were expected to light candles and say prayers. There were, in fact, some of their petitions written out on scraps of paper and stuck to a board with map pins. Distractedly, Aidan read them, feeling sorry for the many people who were so ill. Then he found one that made him so cross he reached over and detached it from the board. It read, "Please pray for my husband Dennis. God come to him in these bad days and help him to forgive me and to find love again. Amy."
He wondered what Amy had done, although he could guess, and his heart went out to poor Dennis. It seemed to Aidan, as he turned the tiny scrap of paper over in his hand, that the answer to Amy's prayers lay with herself. Only she could put things right. No divine intervention was needed at all. How convenient it would be for Aidan if his own troubles could be resolved so easily. Reading some of the other prayers, he concluded that many of these poor folk were feeling as tortured as he was. Will these prayers do any good? He wondered. He doubted it very much.
Pondering on the ill health and anxieties of these unknown petitioners caused Aidan's own feelings of despair to surface once more, and the merry-go-round of his tormenting thoughts began again. In order to divert his mind, he picked up a blue laminated notice from a pile beside the prayer stand, sat on a seat, and read what was on it. This is what it said. Father God cherishes every sparrow. He searches for every lost sheep. He folds in his heart every lonely child and dries every tear. May this God, who is like the warmth of the sun and the strength of the hills, cherish you, embrace you, and fill your life with his healing today and always. Amen.
Fat chance, said his sad heart crossly. If God's so clever he can do all that, why doesn't he go and cherish that dying village child? And he stumbled angrily up some steps, past the flickering candles, into a little side chapel and sat down. The seat on which he rested was tucked out of sight of the main corridor, and he sat hunched up for a long time, a heap of sad, disconsolate misery. while his soul descended to depths of blackness and despair he'd never dreamed existed. No cherishing God, no warm sun, no enfolding arms, just the pain of guilt and remorse and a desperate longing to be comforted.
Suddenly he became aware of a touch, light as a feather, on his shoulder. He glanced up to find himself looking into a wrinkled old face, crisscrossed with myriad lines. Straggly white hair haloed a bald head speckled in brown sunspots, and a tortoise neck seemed to grow out of a clerical collar several sizes too large for it. He could see, too, that the rheumy old eyes, which gazed down at him, were full of sympathy and concern.
"Come with me," said a deep, quiet voice, and Aidan found that his arm was being gently held. He was led through a low door into a tiny, dim stone cell, illuminated by one high window. The room was sparsely furnished with 2 wooden chairs and a prayer desk on which a small pile of books rested. The walls were equally bare, except for a picture of the crucifixion. Although the window only let in a little light, Aidan could see that his mentor was a very old, emaciated clergyman, dressed in a rusty black cassock. A thin hand, disfigured with arthritis, motioned him to one of the chairs, and when the two were seated, the old man said gently, "My name is James. What's your name, my son?" "I'm Aidan," he replied wonderingly. "You have a wonderful namesake," mused the priest almost to himself. What a humble, brave and kind man the first Aidan was. "But tell me your troubles, friend, for you surely have them." His gaze rested on Aidan with infinite kindness, making him feel that he could trust this unknown clergyman who had apparently appeared out of nowhere in order to talk to him.
So Aidan found himself pouring out his troubles. He told him of the trip, of his enjoyment of the city and its sights, of his visit to the safari park, and the discovery of the sick, fly-encrusted child. And then, in a lower voice, and one that halted and stumbled, he recounted the events of the final night, sparing no detail, however painful and sordid. At last he stopped speaking, and silence fell between them. After a while, Father James quietly said,
"And how do you feel, my son?" "Responsible and helpless for the child, Father," replied Aidan, "and desperately guilty for raping the girl. I've asked myself again and again whether it was really my fault, because I'm sure my uncle drugged me. But each time I come back to the fact that it was me. I did it. How could I have done such an awful thing? That must be what I'm really like deep down inside. I can never forgive myself, Father." And putting his head in his hands, he groaned.
Silence fell again, but it was a healing silence this time. Aidan was aware that the very act of telling someone all the dreadful things that had happened had quietened his mind and steadied his inner being. Then the old priest spoke softly again.
"Your guilt," he said gently, "we can do something about. But your sense of responsibility you will have to work out for yourself. Look up." Surprised at the command, Aidan raised his head and found himself looking at the picture of the crucifixion. "Have you any faith?" inquired Father James. "No, none," replied Aidan. "I'm a scientist." A ghost of a smile illuminated the priest's face for a second. "No matter," You may not have found God, but he will find you, he replied. What do you see in this picture? Why, that must be Jesus being crucified, replied Aidan, looking thoughtfully up at the mangled remains of the young body on the cross. What about the other 2 crosses? Inquired Father James gently. Well, I guess they are the 2 thieves, aren't they? Asked Aidan hesitantly, feeling unsure of the exact details of the crucifixion. Yes, they are, said James. One died not knowing forgiveness, but the other one was found by God in the moment of his most extreme need. He could not go to God, but God came to him. Now go and sit in the garden I will show you, and you will know what you have to do.
Aidan allowed himself to be led out of the small cell, round the outer corridor of the chancel behind the high altar, and out into a beautiful cloister garden. But when he turned round to thank Father James, the priest had disappeared. In the centre of the garden a fountain played, its water sparkling in the midday sun, and up above him the massive walls and spire of the cathedral rose up like a vast protecting bulwark. There was no one about, and Aidan, sitting on a bench in the sunshine, felt the deep peace of the centuries seep slowly into his mind. It enfolded him like a soft shawl placed tenderly round a newborn baby. At last, feeling more tranquil than he had done for 3 days, he made his way slowly back into the cathedral and sat for a long time in front of the sculpture of the Holy Family. The white-haired spring cleaner and the students had all gone home, and he and Gervase seemed to be alone together.
What shall I do? He said at length to the tiny, welcoming baby in the manger. Faint and far away, like the echo of a beautiful chord, came the answer. Comfort my world. And Aidan hid these words in a secret place in his heart and felt strangely forgiven. You have been listening to Tis from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight. You may find more information by searching the web for The Garden of Sparkling Delight.